What's up guys, and welcome to my 2026 updated Welt guide. Nowadays, Welt has a lot of ways to be played, whether as a sub DPS for Acheron, a main DPS mainly as crit, or even break. And in this video, I'm taking you over everything you do need to know in order to understand him, and also take you over the multitude of builds he does have. Starting it off with the overview on his kit. Welt will deal imaginary damage based off his attack to a designated enemy for his basic attack. His skill deals imaginary damage equal to his attack to a designated enemy, and further deals damage an additional 2 extra times, with each hit dealing imaginary damage based off his attack to a random enemy. And on hit, there is a 75% base chance to reduce the enemy's speed by 10% for 2 turns. His ultimate will deal imaginary damage based off his attack to all enemies, with a 100% base chance for enemies hit by this to be imprisoned for 1 turn. Imprisoned enemies have their actions delayed by 40% and speed reduced by 10%. Welt's talent allows him to deal additional imaginary damage based off his attack to an enemy when they are slowed. His technique creates a special dimension for 15 seconds. Enemies within that special dimension have their movement speed reduced by 50%, and entering battle with the special dimension active will have a 100% base chance to imprison enemies for 1 turn. Imprisoned enemies via this technique will have their actions delayed by 20% and speed reduced by 10%. Welt's A2, when using ultimate, you have a 100% base chance to increase damage taken by the targets by 12% for 2 turns. His A4 will allow Welt to regenerate 10 energy when using ultimate, and his A6 will deal 20% more damage to enemies inflicted with weakness break. For his Eidolons, his E1 will enhance Welt when using his ultimate. The next 2 times he uses basic attack or skill will deal an extra instance of additional damage to the enemy target. The additional damage dealt when using basic attack is equal to 50% of the basic attack damage multiplier, and the additional damage dealt when using his skill is equal to 80% of the skill damage multiplier. His E2 will regenerate 3 energy when his talent is triggered. His E4 will increase the base chance of reducing the attacked enemy's speed by 35% in his skill. His E6, when using skill, will deal damage for 1 extra time to a random enemy, so increasing his bounce hits on his skill by 1. Before we do hop into the builds, as I did mention in the beginning of the video, Welt does have a multitude of builds, so I'm going to be taking you over multiple options for each of these builds. Similar to Himiko, I will be mentioning if this is good for his crit build, and everything that's good for his crit build also will be good for a hybrid build when it comes to using him with break. And if there's any Lightcones / builds with relics being used for strictly break, I will also mention that, so please be sure you do pay attention. For Welt's Lightcone options, when using him on crit or hybrid, Acheron's signature Lightcone is going to be his best in slot. Providing 36% crit damage, hitting an enemy will inflict Mirage Fizzle on them for a turn. Each time the wearer attacks, this effect can trigger 1 time on each target. The wearer will deal 24% increased damage to enemies with Mirage Fizzle, and damage dealt by ultimate additionally increases by 24%. So this Lightcone is pure damage for Welt. 36% crit damage is going to be increasing any source of damage he does deal when he deals crit damage. Now with the Mirage Fizzle debuff, you are able to deal 24% increased damage to them, so your skill, basic attack, ultimate, whatever can do more damage. And for your ultimate specifically, you will deal an additional 24% increased damage to those targets. Very straightforward Lightcone. This is overall the best performing one still when using him on a crit or hybrid build. Another one you can use is still his Lightcone in the Name of the World, increasing damage to debuff enemies by 24%. When the wearer uses their skill, the effect hit rate for this attack is increased by 18%, and attack is increased by 24%. Also very simple Lightcone, it just provides 24% increased damage to any debuffed enemies, which Welt does provide debuffs, so he is able to capitalize off that himself. Welt also does have a solid effect hit rate margin, and this Lightcone helps you with that by providing effect hit rate for his skill, which is the main one that needs effect hit rate. And now for that skill, your attack will also be increased by 24%, so it's just more damage primarily on skill, which is where most of his damage does come from. So for a more crit sided DPS, even sub DPS and hybrid builds, this Lightcone still does work. For a Welt that is more centric on a sub DPS role for mainly someone like Acheron, Cypher's Lightcone is very good on him, providing a 18% increase to speed with a 120% base chance to inflict Bamboozle on every enemy target when using an attack. Bamboozled enemies will have their defense decreased by 16% for 2 turns. If the wearer does have 170 speed or higher, you will have a 120% base chance to inflict the theft state on every enemy target, and while under the theft state, enemy targets will have their defense decreased by an additional 8% for 2 turns. 18% speed is just going to be good because when you are building a more Acheron-sided sub DPS, you want to build as much speed as possible, while also trying to maintain a good crit ratio, and this Lightcone helps a lot with building speed. To get the full requirement of this Lightcone, you will need 170 speed to also get the theft state, which can be a bit difficult on Welt. However, even without it, 16% defense shred on its own is going to be good for not only his damage, but your Acheron's damage, your sustain's damage. If you have a support doing damage as well, they will do more damage. If you are, however, able to reach 170 speed, then it becomes a 24% defense shred total, which is going to be even better. So for a sub-DPS Welt, primarily on the Acheron teams, this Lightcone is very good on him. For a more DPS-centric Welt, Good Night and Sleep Well is really good. For every debuff the enemy has, damage dealt by the wearer increases by 12%, that stacks up to 3 times. And at S5, it is a 24% increase to the wearer's damage dealt. Since it stacks up to 3 times, you can get up to a 72% increase to damage dealt with this Lightcone at S5. Welt does have access to Imprison, Slow, and also Vulnerability, so he can actually have all the debuffs up by themselves, but having someone else on the team providing some form of debuffs to keep uptime on this can be great, since all his debuffs are not going to have 100% uptime for the entire duration, especially depending how you are building and using him. So another debuffer source is going to be very helpful for this Lightcone to keep uptime, but with its stack, it is a strong option. For a more debuffer-sided Welt, Resolution's Lightcone is also good, allowing the wearer to ensnare an enemy if they have not been ensnared with a 60% base chance. Ensnared enemies have their defense decreased by 12%, and at S5, the base chance becomes 100% with a 16% defense shred to ensnared enemies. It's pretty much a worse version of the Cypher Lightcone, since Cypher Lightcone has a higher base chance, provides speed at base, and also has 16% defense shred as well, going up to 24% if you hit 170 speed. But as a more free-to-play sided alternative, this Lightcone does work as a more sub-DPS coded Welt. When you are using this Lightcone on Welt, be sure there's no one else on the team holding it, because the ensnared effect does not stack. So if you are able to use this Lightcone on a Welt that is more of a sub-DPS slash debuffer, it is a solid option. For DPS slash hybrid DPS Welt, the Boundless Choreo Lightcone is also good, increasing crit rate by 8% and having the wearer deal 24% more crit damage to enemies that are currently slowed or have defense reduced. At S5, it is 16% crit rate with a 48% increase to crit damage dealt. When building a hybrid slash full crit DPS Welt, obviously you want to balance a good crit ratio, so the extra 16% crit rate being provided is very helpful for helping you hit those good thresholds. On top of that, Welt does have access to slow in his kit, so he's able to utilize the second part, allowing him to deal 48% increased crit damage to enemies that have that debuff, which is also going to be a great source of damage anytime you are critting. Of course, if enemies are not slowed or maybe you miss the debuff, the performance of this Lightcone is going to drop off, so ensure you have enough effect hit rate or at least are getting lucky enough to apply the debuff so it is working. Pairing Welt alongside another character that can defense shred might also prove to be very helpful for full uptime always, so when you do have the requirements, this Lightcone is very powerful. If running Welt on a team where someone else can defense shred, the tutorial mission Lightcone also becomes an option to use, providing 20% effect hit rate and attacking defense reduced enemies will regenerate 4 energy. At S5, it's 40% effect hit rate with 8 energy. Welt does not have defense shred in his base kit, so you will need someone else on the team, whether it be through someone's Lightcone, like Pearl's or Cypher's Lightcone, or someone that innately does have defense shred, to get the effect of this Lightcone. Effect hit rate is not useless on Welt, again he does need a solid amount of effect hit rate, so that is nice, and if you are able to get the defense shred part, which if you're running this Lightcone, I'd assume you are, the extra energy can help you get ultimate more, which can potentially help you imprison enemies more frequently, allowing them to attack less. So if you just want Welt to have more debuffs going out with more ultimates, or just helping your team survive longer as a pseudo-sustain, the tutorial mission Lightcone, when you are able to have someone else provide the defense shred, is a solid option. Another option you can use for a more DPS-centric Welt is the Silverwolf signature Lightcone, also providing effect hit rate when the wearer deals damage to enemies that have currently 3 or more debuffs, increases the wearer's crit rate by 12%. After the wearer uses an attack, there's a 100% base chance to implant Aether Code on a random hit enemy that does not have it. Enemies with Aether Code receive 12% increased damage for 1 turn. Once again, effect hit rate being provided is going to be good for Welt's debuffs. Reaching 3 or more debuffs will provide Welt 12% crit rate, which is going to be even more balancing to the ratio that you want to try to get as best as possible. And then at the very end, you can have targets take 12% more damage with Aether Code, which is not only good for his damage, but once again for his team as well. Just like I mentioned with the Good Night and Sleep Well Lightcone, you want to run this if you do have someone else that is providing some form of a debuff, just to make it more consistent. Because if you don't have 3 or more debuffs, or the enemies don't have Aether Code, which usually they always will have Aether Code at least, but the 3 or more debuffs part, if they don't have it, the Lightcone performance does drop off. Otherwise, it is a solid option to use. And finally, for a more debuffer slash sub DPS Welt, you can use the Battle Pass Lightcone Holiday, which will increase the wearer's damage dealt by 16%. Attacking an enemy has 100% 10% base chance to inflict them with vulnerability, which will increase the damage they receive by 10% for 2 turns. And at S5, it is 32% increase to the wearer's damage and 60% vulnerability. So not only are you increasing his own sources of damage, be it through his skill, his ultimate, or basic attack if you have to use it, you also gain access to a debuff with vulnerability, so you can make himself and his team do more damage. So very simple but effective Lightcone you can also use. Now for relic sets, so there are a few sets you can use if you want to run them as a full crit / somewhat hybrid DPS. Again, when I'm referring to hybrid, I'm referring to break. I'm going to talk about those sets before I talk about the break sets. Overall, his best in slot for that role would still be 4-piece Pioneer, which will increase damage dealt to enemies with debuffs by 12%. 4-piece increases wearer's crit rate by 4%, where will deal 8% / 12% increased crit damage to enemies with at least 2 / 3 debuffs, and inflicting a debuff will increase the aforementioned effects by 100% for 1 turn. The 2-piece will always be active since Welt is able to debuff enemies. 4-piece provides crit rate, so that's going to be good for building him, and now also increased crit damage dealt to enemies that do have more debuffs. Reaching 3 will get the full effects, and again, Welt does inflict debuffs, so once he inflicts a debuff after enemies have 3 or more, you are able to increase the aforementioned effects. So running him on a crit team or a hybrid team, overall, the 4-piece Pioneer set is going to be the one that slightly edges out any of the other options. Another set you can use is 4-piece Scholar. 2-piece increases crit rate by 8%, 4-piece increases damage dealt by skill and ultimate by 20%, and after using ultimate, this increases the damage dealt by next skill by 25%. 2-piece provides some crit rate to help you with your ratio balancing, and the 4-piece will increase his primary sources of damage being skill and ultimate, and also a further increase the damage when it comes to his actual primary source being his skill. This is mainly the set you would also want to use if you're fully committing to a crit build, as the 4-piece doesn't really do much for break. So if you are running him on a fully crit build team, whether it be a sub DPS or just his own main DPS on a crit team, 4-piece Scholar does work. 4-piece Wastelander also does work, with 2-piece imaginary damage increased by 10%. 4-piece will increase the wearer's crit rate by 10% when dealing damage to debuffed enemies, and dealing damage to imprisoned enemy targets will increase their crit damage by 20%. 2-piece increases all his form of damage since he is an imaginary character, and as he does debuff enemy targets, you also will get a 10% increase from the 4-piece, and his ultimate is able to imprison enemies, or when you do break with the imaginary break effect, you are also able to imprison them via that as well, so you have multiple ways to get the 20% increase to crit damage as well, providing you up to 10% crit rate and 20% crit damage from a 4-piece, which is very valuable. Having full uptime on this is not going to be always the case, as enemies in battles, especially later on, are not always going to be imprisoned, but even then, the 4-piece is usable. And once you finally do get that imprisoned via his ultimate or breaking, this becomes a very solid option to use for a crit Welt / hybrid Welt. Now, if you fully want to commit to the super break side of Welt, 4-piece Iron Cavalry is going to be one of the best options. 2-piece increasing break effect by 16%, 4-piece reaching 150% or higher break effect will make the break damage dealt to enemy targets ignore 10% of their defense, and if reaching 250% or higher break effect, super break damage dealt to enemy targets will additionally ignore 15% of their defense. So with a full break build, obviously the 2-piece increasing break effect is going to be helpful, with the 4-piece providing you multiple defense ignore sources, which is going to be one of the better ways to increase damage dealt for any break DPS. So if you do want to commit to the full side of break Welt, you want to run a 4-piece Iron Cavalry. Now this last set is a bit more niche and was used back then and not too much now, but still can be used if you do build it right, and that is running 4-piece Eagle set. 4-piece after the wearer uses their ultimate, action is advanced forward by 25%. The entire point of the set is primarily for Acheron, just to get more turns to inflict more debuffs, so practically it becomes to the point where you just sacrifice most stats and just go for full speed amounts, just so you can get a bunch more ults and constantly refresh the 4-piece. Pair this with the tutorial mission Lightcone, which can be a bit difficult since you do at least need someone else on the team that can shred defense so you can get the actual energy. But if you do have a setup where it does work, it can be pretty good to set up ways to generate more debuffs for Acheron so she can get her ultimate more. But that's really the only case you want to do nowadays. It also did work for pseudo sustained Welt, but pseudo sustained Welt isn't really a powerful thing anymore, especially with how strong enemies have gone and how fast they've gone. The speed reductions and all that stuff from Welt doesn't really help out too much nowadays. So it's primarily if you do want to generate as much debuffs for Acheron as possible. For planet ornaments, this also does depend if you want to commit to the break side or if you want to commit to the crit side, or also if you want to commit to the more supportive sub DPS role for someone like Acheron. For more on the crit side, you can run Glamoth, which increases attack by 12% when the wearer speed is equal to or higher than 135/160. The wearer deals 12%/18% more damage. 160 speed, this does depend on your speed buffs and obviously your build, and maybe if you're running Cypher Lightcone or not as well. Provides 12% attack at all times, which is going to increase all the sources of damage, and you practically always will have the 12% damage increase, since Welt will always be built with 135 speed or higher usually because it's always breakpoint, but in this case you would just need to make sure you hit 135. But if you are able to reach 160 in battle for 18% more damage, that is going to be even better. So for a more crit-sided Welt, be it DPS or sub-DPS, this is usually the best option still. Another option you can use is Relic Arena, which will increase the wearer's crit rate by 8% when the wearer reaches 70% or higher crit rate. Damage dealt by basic attack and skill increases by 20%. 70% or higher crit rate on a crit Welt should not really be a problem since you want to have close to 100% anyways. It will pretty much just be a free 20% increase to damage dealt by basic attack and skill. Basic attack not as valuable, skill very valuable as that is mainly his source of damage. Unfortunately, it doesn't impact his ultimate damage, which is also his other form of damage, but skill is the main thing you are trying to buff, so Relic Arena is another option you can use. When it comes to Break Welt, if you are running him alongside the Dahlia or you're taking him into a battle with fire weakness, you would want to run the Forge set. Increases speed by 6% and increases break effect by 40% when attacking someone with fire weakness for one turn. This is going to provide you the best effects for a full break Welt, 6% speed and 40% break effect. The reason I mentioned the Dahlia specifically is because the Dahlia is always able to implant fire weakness thanks to how her dance partner function works, where she herself is always considered a dance partner and then she would be giving dance partner to Welt mainly. So she was always able to implant fire weakness, which is herself, and then Welt's weakness, which is imaginary, so hitting a fire enemy will provide you the full 40% break effect, which will make Forge always the best for any break DPS. Now, if you are not running him with the Dahlia or you're taking him into a battle that doesn't have fire weakness, you would want to run Talia instead, providing 16% break effect, and reaching 145 speed or higher will additionally increase the effect by 20%. So 36% break effect, so it is a worse Forge, 4% less break effect with no speed buff. But the requirement is mainly just in your personal stats. Running a full break Welt would require you to build a lot more speed anyways, and break characters have a lot of ways to get speed via a other buff such as Ruan Mei as well, depending on your team. So usually that shouldn't really be a problem. Now, if you are running him and you mainly want to run him as the sub DPS for Acheron, now if you're running him as a sub DPS for Acheron or something and you don't really care too much about his personal damage and you want to focus on more buffing of like Acheron and such, then you can run Lushaka, providing 5% energy regen rate. And if the character is not the first character in the team lineup, increases the attack of the first character in the team lineup by 12%. In this case, it would be Acheron. So 5% energy regen for Welt, which can help him get his ultimate a little more and a little quicker, while also providing Acheron, in this case, 12% attack. For the main stats on the relics, for the body, primarily you want to do crit rate. For the feet, you want to run speed. For the orb, you want to run imaginary damage. And for the link rope, you can do attack percent if you're running him as a crit or hybrid. But if you want to fully commit to break, in that case, you can run a break effect rope. For the substats, first is always going to be a speed priority no matter the build. If you're running a crit build on Welt, usually that's going to be followed by a -1 setup, so you would want to have him have 1 speed over your -1 character being Sunday or Bronya. So if your Sunday or Bronya speed is 136, of course, in that case, you would need Welt to have 137 to 139. If you're running Glamoth, obviously you need to have 135 speed as well, so for any speed threshold requirements, you want to hit that. Past that, getting effect hit rate rolls is going to be beneficial. I did mention you want to build them with effect hit rate, but to fully focus on effect hit rate to guarantee every single one of Welt's debuffs is going to be a drop off in damage at the same time. So the best thing you can do is actually just try to get effect hit rate rolls in your pieces. If you're running a Lightcone that provides effect hit rate, or you're running something like his signature Lightcone, quote unquote signature, the one in the standard banner, the name of the world, in that case, those would help you a lot to get the guaranteed debuff procs. But realistically, you don't have to go for the full amount, just try to get as much as you can. Getting around 40% would be ideal. And then ideally for a crit or hybrid, crit rate, crit damage, attack percent after that. For a full crit build, if you're running him with Sunday, you want to get 80% so you can hit 100% in battle with Sunday buff. Otherwise, just try to get it to 85% or higher, since of course on these kind of characters, it might be a bit difficult to get crit rate. For crit damage, just try to get 120% or higher. If you're running hybrid, of course, focus on everything I did mention. You can focus a bit less on crit rate and crit damage for a hybrid, just try to get maybe around 60 to 70%. Crit damage, just like around 100%. Attack rolls are so nice, but in that case, you'd also want to get break effect rolls, and even more speed would be your priority. However, if you are running a super break Welt, where you're mainly just running full break gear, Iron Cavalry with like Forge and the Dahlia team, if you want to fully commit to his break stats and you're not really interested in a hybrid build, in that case, you mainly just focus on speed and break effect. Speed, just get as much as you can. Of course, break points are nice, so 134 minimum. But if you're able to reach 160 plus in battle, that's going to be great. With break effect, if you are in this case running Iron Cavalry, which I assume you would be, 250% or higher break effect so you get the full effect. For speed specifically, if you are running Talia, be sure to get 145 so you get the full effect of that set as well. And then for a sub DPS for Acheron, depending on if you're just going full hyperspeed Eagle set with like tutorial mission Lightcone with someone else defense shredding, in that case you mainly just focus on as much speed as possible, get hyperspeed or even more if you can. But even then, if you can still manage to balance a solid crit ratio, that is going to be your goal. But in that case, I would assume you mainly can't. So I'd mainly just be recommending speed and effect hit rate just so you can guarantee those debuffs. As I did mention when I was talking about it, for Cypher Lightcone, in any case when you are running that Lightcone, if you are able to reach 170 speed on the build you are doing, that's going to be ideal. So if you are, again, running Cypher Lightcone, that is going to be one of the higher priorities for you to hit. Now for team building. So of course, this does mainly depend on what role you're kind of putting him into. Are you running him as a super break DPS? Are you running him as a crit DPS? Or are you just running him as a sub DPS for Acheron? I'm going to start with break just because it's easier, but I do not have the Dahlia on my account, so the second slot would be going to Dahlia. Dahlia is a non-negotiable teammate to the break team nowadays, so that would always be going in this slot. The third slot, if you especially have something like E1 Fugue, E1 Fugue would be a go-to. Even at E0, she would be on the team if you can run her. So it would be the Dahlia and Fugue with Welt, and the last slot would go to your Sustain, depending on if you're doing Sustain or Sustainless. If you're doing Sustain for break teams, the best in slot would be Linksha or also just Gallagher. You can run either or. In my case, I'll just put Linksha on here. So the team would look like this, again, well, as a super break DPS, the Dahlia, Fugue, and Linksha. For substitutes, if you don't have Fugue, let's just say you can run Harmony MC instead. My MC is set to Remembrance, and I'm too lazy to switch it, so just pretend this is Harmony MC, or you could even put someone like Ruan Mei. Ruan Mei still does work fine on these break teams. But let's say you're running this exact team here, but you want to run Sustainless. In that case, of course, you would replace the Sustain with one of the two I mentioned, so Harmony MC, or also just Ruan Mei. Now, if you're running a crit build on Welt and running him just as a crit DPS as a hyper carry, usually that's always going to be paired with a -1 setup. So in my case, I'd use Sunday, as he's usually always the best for especially older DPS like Welt. So you'd run Welt Sunday. If you don't have Sunday, you could just use Bronya instead. Third slot would go to another support. That does depend on who you have. Tribi is fantastic as her buffs are just universally good, and she can also help out with damage. You can also run Robin. Robin is also very good on these teams. In my case, I'm just going to go ahead and put Robin here, and then the last slot would go to your Sustain if you are doing a sustained run. The best sustain for Welt would be Danhang Permancer Terre, so the team would look something like this, and then again you would sub out depending on what you are doing. If you're running Sustainless, of course, sub out the last slot for another support. Let's just say use whoever you can. Again, you can throw someone like Tribi, you can throw another debuffer like Cypher as well. You can even use someone like RMC, or even someone like Ruan Mei, so on and so forth. Now lastly, as a Nihility character for the Acheron team, if you want to run a double Nihility setup, which I personally would recommend if you're running an E0 Acheron and you're still using Welt, the next Nihility slot usually would go depending on who you do have. Cypher is one of the best options you can use. You can also still use someone like Xiaochu, who's also really good, especially for E0 Acheron. You can even use someone like Silverwolf as well. Usually you would just go ahead and pick one of your other options for a second Nihility. Last slot would go to your Sustain. For Acheron, usually it's also just Danang, so the team would look something like this. However, if you want to run an action advancer even with an E0 Acheron, or if your Acheron's E2, in that case you would just sub out the other Nihility. Let's just say you don't have Cypher, but you have Sunday and an E2 Acheron, so you just go ahead and put Sunday on there instead. Again, if you're running a setup with tutorial mission Welt, you would need someone else on the team providing defense shred. So usually that would be in the form of debuffers, so you could use Cypher if she's holding her Lightcone. You could just use Silverwolf as a character. You can even use someone like Pela. So for tutorial mission specifically, remember to keep that in mind. And then if you're running Sustainless, again, you could sub out the Sustain slot for someone that's like an AoE buffer. Tribi, that can also buff Welt and Acheron's damage. You can use Robin as well. She can go in that slot as well. Really just depends on your options. That is my full updated 2026 Welt guide. I do hope you found this video helpful. If you did, dropping a like would be greatly appreciated. If you're new to the channel or haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon for future videos like this, along with all types of style content. Check the description to check out my Arc Dance channel, and I'll see you later. Peace out.